Our reading today is the final revision of Article 2, Purposes and Covenant from October 2023. As Unitarian Universalist, we covenant congregation to congregation through our association to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, these shared values are
interdependence. Interdependence. Is my microphone on yet? It is interdependence. And as we read these, if you have a value on that corresponds to a value, feel free to, share your value on with the world. Interdependence. We honor the interdependent web of all existence. With reverence for the great web of life and with humility, we acknowledge our place in it. We covenant to protect Earth and all beings from exploitation. We will create and nurture sustainable relationships of care and respect, mutuality and justice. We will work to repair harm and damaged relationships.
pluralism. We celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect.
Justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved community where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. We support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions within our congregations, our association, and society at large.
Transformation. We adapt to the changing world. We covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian and Universalist heritages, never complete and never perfect.
Generosity. We cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality.
Equity. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities.
We talk about this all today because we are a living tradition. I don't know if anyone has a hymnal next to them. Some people do. Mignon maybe does. It says right on it, singing the living tradition. Oh yeah. Normally there's one up here, singing the living tradition. A secret is though that these little shelves under the pulpit are a little wobbly, so sometimes the heavy books have to move. All right, thank you, Becca. So, not all of us have hymnals by our seats because technology has changed, and so have we, and now we often put our lyrics on these screens. In similar ways, we are always changing. The purposes of our denomination are required to be updated regularly, in fact, because we know that we are a living tradition that must grow and change and be relevant in this time and in these places. So that's part of what we're talking about today. And I want to acknowledge also that there's always growing pains and loss when we talk about change, as well as excitement, right? We've been experiencing just like a lot more, sometimes joyous and sometimes like really upset noise in worship, because we've been worshiping with more of our folks in here. And some of us might feel excited about that all the time, and some of us might sometimes feel like a little annoyed because it's harder to concentrate when there's like noise happening. So I just want to say, like, acknowledge how you're feeling and be like, oh, that's interesting. I'm feeling upset about that right now. Like, what's going on? You know, because that is a part of change. And I'll also say that it's something that we as a community will just continue to get better at doing, right? Pam and I are going to be working, keep your eyes peeled, on gathering a team together to help us think about some shifts that we want to make if we want to have our kids with us in service a little more like they were this morning. What needs to change? What might need to change space-wise? What might need to change about our words? So know that change is happening beautifully and imperfectly, as it always does, and that you can stay tuned, those of you who want to be more involved in that particular shift. Okay. We are changing here as a fellowship, as a community, and so is our denomination. So the rest of this year, we're actually going to be talking about the 7 values that have been proposed in the new purposes of our association. We'll talk about that more in a second for those who are like, what are they talking about right now? So our values will actually be our worship theme for the next 7 months. Each month in worship, we have a different theme that centers us and that provides kind of an arc of what we're able to talk about and delve into and deepen together in that particular month. So each value that you just heard read by Becca and I will be our theme for our next 7 months of worship. This month, we begin with justice. Now, some of you know that Pam, as part of her adult religious education work, has held several sessions on Article 2 as a whole to prepare us. And now we're going to be digging into these values in a slightly different, more both contemplative and action-oriented way. So, you heard the values, and we'll talk about that more at the very end, but I'm going to step back for a moment to talk about Article 2 of the bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And that is the part of our bylaws that talks about our purposes. Now, the first version of this was written the year Unitarians and Universalists became one Unitarian Universalist Association in 1961. So for context, this was 7 years before the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, as we'll be talking a little bit more about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King next week. Now, they needed to figure out, the Unitarians and the associations, when they became one denomination, what they were together, and so they came up with 7 principles. Now, these were revised fairly significantly in 1984, but they have not undergone significant revisions since this time. So there have been no revisions, no significant revisions on a document that has been around longer than I have been here on this earth. That's like a pretty long time and probably something we should update, right? So one significant revision that I will name is the 8th principle, which is a grassroots effort to center racial justice that has been adopted by over 200 congregations and UU organizations. They're not this one yet, but that's a sermon for another day, which we'll get to. So we talk a lot about the values, those 7 values and the 7 valuons that we heard about today, but there are some other things that happen in this Article 2 session of our purposes that is important for us to at least name. So the first one is that we talk about our purpose. Now, this hasn't changed a whole lot since the 1984 one, but to lift up a couple, I think, more significant shifts that have happened, is that it's named that we will heal historic injustices and that we'll support and encourage the creation of new Unitarian Universalist communities. Now that part was in there before, that we support and encourage the creation of new Unitarian Universalist communities, but before they used the name congregation. And that indicates that there are newer Unitarian Universalist communities spurting up that might be really small, right? They might be meeting as like a dinner group or something, and the Unitarian Universalist Association is working to acknowledge that those two are really significant religious communities for folks. They just might not use the name congregation. So another shift that happened is that before we said to advance our Unitarian Universalist principles in the world, now of course it's to advance our Unitarian Universalist values in the world. There we go. And a new little bullet point that was added was that the Unitarian Universalist Association will actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. Love is now. So those are the significant changes that I think it's helpful for us to be aware of in the purposes, as like the Unitarian Universalist Association's primary purposes are list. All right, next up is inspirations. Now I think this part is particularly interesting because the last version of Article 2 named Judeo-Christian heritage explicitly, as well as humanist and earth-centered traditions. But here's what it says now. It says, direct experiences of transcending mystery and wonder are primary sources of Unitarian Universalist inspiration. These experiences open our hearts, renew our spirits, and transform our lives. We draw upon and are inspired by sacred, secular, and scientific understandings that help us make meaning and live into our values. These sources ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. We respect the histories, contexts, and cultures in which these sources were created and are currently practiced. It goes on to say, grateful for the experiences that move us, aware of the religious ancestries we inherit, and enlivened by the diversity which enriches our faith, we are called to ever deepen and expand our wisdom. It's quite beautiful in general, but it's also really interesting to name that instead of listing out different sources that Unitarian Universalists might look to, it just states that there are many sources and acknowledges that we want to be respectful of the histories and all of our ancestries. I think a nice shift this makes is that it acknowledges that we truly are a theologically pluralistic community, right? We've talked about in this fellowship, and it's talked about in New Here gatherings, how what this fellowship believes in is shifted by every person who is engaging in our community, right? What we believe in, the religious ancestries and histories that we bring, shape who this fellowship is right now. So by not listing Judeo-Christian and humanist and earth-centered, we are giving some space for the breadth of whatever context folks might have come into, and acknowledging that that is also really, really profound. So that's one shift. I do think it's interesting that, as we talked about in our history session, Unitarians and Universalists were Christian traditions, and that is not being named anymore, right? So just an interesting thing to note, right? That's a big shift. Okay. The next one we're going to talk about is, well, I actually won't talk about it. There's a statement on freedom of belief. There's not huge changes, but there's a change that I think is significant to name. So the current version says, congregational freedom and the individual's right of conscience are central to Unitarian Universalist heritage. Congregations may establish statements of purpose, covenants, and bonds of union, so long as they do not require that members adhere to a particular creed. So that last part is fairly similar, although a little more explicit, that we're saying like congregations, fellowship, churches cannot require anyone to adhere to a particular creed, right? And it also acknowledges that this concept of freedom and an individual right of conscience was a very important value when Unitarianism was being founded, right? It's a very important part of Unitarian heritage. Okay. Those are kind of like the other shifts, and that was a drier sermon than I normally like to give. But now we're gonna think on our own about values. So we heard a lot already about these 7 values and how love is at the center. So one thing I wanted to be really clear about is that if you were looking at those values, or even the values as Pokemon, and they're actually in the back of the sanctuary and on the screen as well, is that it is okay if these values are not your personal core values, right? That would actually be a little bit of a ridiculous expectation if like each one of us was perfectly aligned with these like larger values of our association, right? So it can, however, as we talk about values, be an opportunity for each of us to think about what our personal core values are. So were I someone who enjoyed giving homework assignments, which I am, I would say, take some time to think about what your core personal values are. This is a great New Year question, right? What are the values that are most important to me? If it's hard to just think of them, you can actually just Google like 50 common core values, and this like beautiful list pops up. And then you can think about, how is my life and the way it's being lived now aligned with these core values, and how is it not, right? Because life happens and they're not always aligned. And as we're taking stock of a new year, now is a really good time to think about these questions. The other thing we can do is think about these shared values that we have together. Are these the values that we think do bind us together as a community, but also all Unitarian Universalists together, right? Do we want to be a faith that has love at the center, and different forms like justice and generosity that this love takes in our shared and collective lives together? We'll be talking a lot more about all this year, and we'll be having plenty of time to delve into these values in a more spiritual and reflective state, which I really look forward to. So may we think about our personal core values, reflect on these proposed shared values for our association, and check out what you need to do to level up your value on. And if you didn't get one and you really want to, maybe let us know, and Pam might have some more that we can give you at the end, because I know everyone wants to like have a fun Pokemon value card. All right, may we continue to reflect on those core values of what is most important to us as individuals and as a collective. May it be so, and may we make it so. Amen.